About sound system innovation. Now, before I introduce the panel, I just want to say, as a youth, we're going to Jamaica still. Sound system is a very integral part of the culture. Some of us may not have had the music in our eardrums. We may have heard it a far distance off, while some of us may have been living around the road from where sound system play. And in some way, shape, or form, you're going to gravitate towards it. As a little youth, and many people give this testimony, you kind of sneak out of your house at a nice hour when your people are asleep and find yourself to the dance hall to experience this cosmic magnetic pull, which is the sound system, which is the music. From me about early teens, 12, 13, me I sneak out of my yard for God dance just to go and feel that vibe. And the music has never left me, so much so that I am a practitioner of it today. Music is life. It's a healer, it's therapy. It is the high you need without the other high you can get in other types of mediums. So it's great to speak about the sound system and how things have changed since the stacking up of speaker boxes and things. Things have definitely changed, the demographic has changed, and these speakers here today will be touching on different aspects of sound and sound system. So, now that I've said that and I've introduced myself as a performer as well as a presenter coming up tomorrow, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stephanie Alisk. Now, Stephanie is the chair representative of the Theory and History of Popular Music at the Institute of Musicology and Media Studies in Berlin. Her PhD is in musicology with a focus on popular music studies and music ethnology. She is involved in the Berlin music industry from the technological aspect, and she's also a DJ and does freelance management of radio and DJ workshops. Some of her research interests include Kuduro, which is an electronic music form from Angola, music and physical performative practice in the Black Atlantic, pleasure politics, and sound system epistemology. With a number of publication and editorial activities under her belt, could you please put your hands together and welcome to center stage, Dr. Stephanie Alisk.
Thank you, Asante, for the kind introduction. Can you hear me? Should I project more? Should we put, is this good? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here and share some, can we make this bigger somehow? Or can you all read this? You can? No? Okay, fine. Well, I'll explain more and hope I keep with the timing. Yeah, I'm thrilled to share some considerations towards an epistemology of sound systems in a comparative perspective here with you today, and I look forward to hear your critical feedback and to these ideas, and also my profound thanks to Professor Nair and also to Aaron McLeod in absentia for making this happen here this weekend. This talk is really a preliminary step towards developing a research project which is at this point in time called Sound System Epistemologies. It is a project that strives to investigate ways of knowing, to quote Julian Enriquez, around sound system practices. And by quoting Enriquez, I'm also acknowledging that at the time of writing the abstract, I had overlooked his work, so I need to rectify the claim that the knowledge required to perform sound system practices has not yet been construed through an academic lens. Enriquez has done this work in sonic bodies, and as such, I have a reference to bounce my thoughts off when working towards a comparative perspective. Now, for today's presentation, I have organized my thoughts around these three main aspects, and I shall bounce through these, skip through these in order to stick to the 15 minutes, hopefully. So what's my motivation to develop such a project? I approached this sound system epistemologies project coming from my previous research on electronic dance music from Angola called Kuduro. Who has heard Kuduro, or who knows what it sounds like? Okay, I'll play some Kuduro for you, for your entertainment. This is Dança da Maju by DJ Snobia, really a producer prodigy. Can you turn this up? And so forth, just to give you a little impression. So during my research, which comprised several stays in the Angolan capital, Luanda, in Lisbon, Paris, Maputo, and Amsterdam, I noticed striking similarities between Jamaican dancehall and Angolan kuduro, such as the fact that with every new song, usually there's a new dance, and if the dance catches on, the song becomes a hit. There's lots of acrobatic and also rather aggressive dancing by very skilled dancers in kuduro and dancehall, and there is a certain battle culture to it, and all of this is conveyed in an overall very competitive and kind of hyperbolic attitude. And in this sense, kuduro and dancehall are so similar in many ways, yet apart from reel to reels, I like to move it, which is often quoted as a foundational instrumental in kuduro. There is no kuduristas have mentioned to me any kind of overt connections between dancehall and kuduro, so I had a dilemma. And of course, Paul Gilroy, to the rescue, in his seminal Black Atlantic, he suggested to see the whole of the Atlantic as one cultural space with cultural exchanges that are constantly happening, that are open-ended, and he suggests to take an explicitly transnational and intercultural perspective, which suits, of course, the complexities of kuduro's music and dance, because people revert to Congolese music, they refer to Balearic house, they refer to hard techno from the 1990s, to MC Hammer dance routines, and so forth. And in his book, The Black Atlantic, Gilroy asks us, how are we to think critically about artistic products and aesthetic codes which, though they may be traceable back to one distinct location, have been changed by either the passage of time or by the displacement, relocation, or dissemination through networks of communication and cultural exchange. And so I took this cue from Gilroy to think about kuduro in transnational terms and to place kuduro within the larger context of sound system cultures of the Black Atlantic rather than any other concept of globalized popular music. And in this sense, beside seeing the sound system as a particular configuration of audio equipment, people who fulfill different roles, such as engineer, DJ, selector, audience, massive, but also the dancers, I decided, perform pre-recorded music in order to make people dance. I propose, and this still in an attempt to answer Gilroy's question, to view sound system cultures of the Black Atlantic also as a performative mode. And in order to do this, in order to adequately grasp and honor the performative processes and that are happening here, and thus in analysis also to honor the specificity of the musical and bodily performative practices, because they are motivated through this particular configuration. So what unites these sound system cultures of the Black Atlantic, you know this better than I do. The sound system is an assemblage of audio equipment. It's the people who run it. It's the audience, obviously, who has to have a knowledge of what's performed and how to respond to it. Sound system is also a business model. It's also a particular collection of sonic media of a repertoire, and it's also a particular configuration of ways of knowing. And so I suggest here, still in an attempt to answer Gilroy's question, that we look at sound system cultures not only in terms of ethnographic description, but also in terms of knowledge production, to see the sound system as an epistemological nexus where different ways of knowing converge. So knowing about the sonic materiality, that which sounds, how is the music actually made, then the mediality of the recorded sound, be it handling sevens without any metadata rather than scratched in little end groove coded signs, taking into consideration knowledge about transcultural movements, taking into consideration knowledge about room acoustics, electroacoustics, knowledge about handling certain interfaces, knowledge of how to conduct a certain vocal practice, obviously also knowledge of bodily performative practices that are evoked by sound. And by bodily performative practices, I don't mean only dance, I mean also ways of moving the body, pointing gestures, and so forth, and also, obviously, also knowledge around battle cultures, pleasure politics, and the economy of running a sound system. And I decided to bring something to this conference. There's no need me coming from Berlin talking to you about Jamaican sound system culture. So as I propose this project in a comparative transnational perspective, I now turn to Kuduro, and in Kuduro, knowledge around audio technology is not one of the strong points. People often lack knowledge of audio technology, or they make their music sound as if they do, sometimes deliberately. So today I look at a particular role in the configuration of the Kuduro sound system performance, that of the animador, which is the person who's otherwise known as the MC or DJ. And it's mostly a he. And I look at his role and his intersection with other roles. So, excuse me. Vocal practice in Kuduro is distinct form, yet akin to musical microphone work in other genres of Angolan popular music. And besides pre-written lyrics, autotune or coarse non-pitched vocals, which are the norm in Kuduro, there's also a very prevalent and performatively effective vocal performance, which is more freely strung together lyrics, which are called animação, animation. And, sorry. Animação is often scoffed at or derided as mere shouting or only animation, not singing and melodies. But I argue that animação is indeed an intricate practice that requires knowledge and stamina and technique. And it is key to producing successful Kuduro, which has a certain kind of aggressive impetus, which people describe with carga. So I noticed that at different entertainment types of celebration in Luanda, more often than not, there is an animador, and this person holds the event together by announcing the different stage acts. They typically intersperse their presentations with well-known call and response phrases. You see some here. I won't read them out for the sake of time. And formulaic chants with jokes and references to the current popular culture or the ongoing event. And while animadores are a staple figure in Kuduro, they are by no means confined to this genre. So, but there are also celebrations without animadores, because some Kuduro DJs prefer to work without them because they can hamper the building up of carga if they're not very skillful. Kuduro anima sound can happen in different ways. It's in a typical scenario, a vocalist, between performing their songs, they may hype up the audience over the microphone. And when a dancer shares the stage, or several dancers share the stage with a vocalist, a more specific meaning of anima sound is that of dance calling, and where the animador shouts out names of dance moves and names of dancers, and it's like we can see here. And when the music is lacking, the animador can also produce percussive noises, vocally or through clapping hands or through beating on their thighs, in order to emulate an electronic beat. This is called this is adosar, to sweeten. And some people say that they prefer to dance with adosamento, sweetening, because it gives them more power. So a staple of the animadores repertoire is to use these call and response phrases that I have shown, antiphonic couplets that are supposed to convey something like knowledge, like aphorisms or proverbial teachings, but they're newly coined, so they're also playful double entendres. And animadores also use phrases to incite an effective response. Beside these couplets, they use phrases that refer to the intensity of the ongoing performance. So they use phrases like essa mama, this one, mama, or e show, just it's a show, or tadose, it's sweet. So they also intersperse their performances with these kind of rousing two-syllable exclamations like "Away," you probably heard if you ever listened to Angolan music. But they also draw attention to the affective qualities. So Sebain, who we see here, likes to say things like, you need to feel it in the bones, or bear this, or feel this, or bring it up, which can refer to the volume of the music, or saying things like pusha, which means like something like pull ahead, which can refer to the beat or just the overall performance. And one very particular meaning of animação, as I said, is that of dance calling, and the interaction between the animador and the dancer is one of the most key things in Kuduro. The animadores use indexical expressions typically to incite the performance of a dance move. So they would say something like "Olha, look," to prod dancers into action, but also call for the due attention of the audience. So they will say "Olha" and then put the name of dance move. So the dancer will perform this move, and quite often these "Olha, boneco," "Olha, "Olha, fogareiro" are phrases that then transition from the live performance into recorded music as well. So again, the animadores' knowledge is key to creating a successful Kuduro performance. And I quote here the dancer Mangunai. He says, "The animador gives the dancer inspiration. Likewise, the dancer gives inspiration to the singer, i.e. the animador. When the animador is good, the thing goes really well. A good animador is one who is on top of the beat and he creates his thing in the moment. Maybe he's animating, and maybe there's someone with a suit in the audience and he will see this guy and goes, 'Look, Daddy is seeing you. Look, Daddy is seeing you.' Or you create a trick, meaning a dance move, that gives him inspiration, and he catches this dance move and then goes and runs with it and plays with it. And I think that this division of work between the animator and the dancer is really key to allows this kind of cognitive distribution of labor, really allows the dancers to excel, and really allows also the whole sound system configuration of a Kuduro performance to actually excel. Now, I also promised some methodic suggestions as to how can we go about investigating these forms of knowledge. And I mentioned earlier that in this broader concept of the sound system cultures of the Black Atlantic, the dancers and knowledge around dance is also something that needs to be taken into consideration. And for the Kuduro research, I have developed a form of interview, which is actually a combination of having a verbal interview, a biographic interview, but also dancing with the dancer as they are discussing their work in order to mobilize this tacit bodily knowledge. And with that, I land on minute 0 and leave you here with the suggestion to see the sound system as an epistemological nexus of all these different practices and dimensions that come together. Thank you.
All right, good stuff. I hope we enjoyed that first presentation. You mentioned some interesting things. You speak about the function of the MC, calling out the names of the dances, and basically like shepherding the dance. If anybody's been in a Jamaican dance scene, it's the same situation. Almost every song has a dance move to it, and the selector is there saying, all right, broke it down now, broke it down, all right, turn it up, all right, do that move there, do that move. It's the same vibe, so we can see the connectivity and the connection between the peoples, even despite where we are. So that's beautiful. Good work. Our next speaker, let me introduce him quickly. This is very interesting, very interesting work. Dr. William Edmonds is a lecturer in music in the University of Newcastle in the UK. Now, William is a composer, performer, and the primary materials of his compositions come from recorded media, sequencing and sampling, 8-bit techno, i.e. Game Boy and Nano Loop, voice, online videos, and drawing. His varied interest in music and sound caused him to create various artist/performer monikers. Example, Gwilly Edmonds, Gustav Thomas, and Copydex, just to name a few. His primary aesthetic is wild pop, which he formally launched in October 2017 and uses it as an umbrella to house the various strands of research he's involved in. His research interests rest quite heavily on experimentation and improvisation of sound, and each area of focus he pursues under this broad heading is distributed across his various monikers. With a number of publications also under his belt, please help me to welcome Dr. William Edmonds to the floor.
Wow, amazing. Thanks, Asante. Wasn't expecting that. It saved me a lot of time, actually. You've been introduced. Thanks very much. I'm going to invite you into a personal micro-universe that has to do with my day-to-day work as a lecturer, as a teacher of music at Newcastle. And hopefully what will come through are the broader socio-economic implications of those struggles that I'm engaging with on a day-to-day basis. So I've long been concerned with ways that music instills and reinforces ideologies, especially the ways that music that most people listen to, the most heavily marketed, reinforces dominant ruling ideologies. And I mean literally music, the material substance and technical frameworks of music rather than lyrics or visual packaging. I'm concerned with how music affects people's outlook, partly because in teaching music, I have to fight so hard against deeply ingrained conservatism, particularly among students, unfortunately. When I say conservatism, I mean accepting dominant power narratives and neglecting to question the origins of European wealth and its cultures. I hope that it will become clear over this paper about how deeply entrenched imperial and colonialist ideologies still are in music education in Western establishments. And when I say music education, I mean strictly within pedagogy from early schooling right through higher education and the broader social and political implications of that. The centrality and vitality of music to collective human experience is forever overlooked by dominant culture in no less a way than the vitality of the human spirit is perpetually overlooked by dominant ideologies. At the start of his 2014 Red Bull Academy lecture, when asked to introduce himself, for those in the audience who might have known who he was or what he did, Jashaka Ventures, this is Jashaka, spiritual sound system, playing spiritual music. In the 60s in England, where there were a lot of difficulty for people arriving from the Caribbean, the music was the thing that kept people together. Because when the people left Africa to go to Jamaica and the Caribbean, all they could bring was their songs and their music. They weren't able to bring things with them on the slave ship. They weren't able to. All they had was their songs and memories of home. So over the years, the music has kept people together. He's talking about it being spiritual, and it's that spiritual and spirit have been mentioned several times today, which is really gratifying. I'll just underline for those who aren't familiar with the kind of European classical establishment environment, spirit and spiritual are not words that are ever spoken within the music department in general, sadly. He goes on to stress that this notion of keeping people together through a sound that taps deep collective well of memory and history, the essence of which is this materially nothing, dispossessed, sense set against a spiritually all. Because of how music is taught, how it's sold and how it's co-opted as a device of repression, it's easy to forget to consider that what music essentially is. Music is a manifestation, perhaps the purest expression of the human spirit. Okay, so in order to proceed, I need to provide a bit of context where I'm coming from. First of all, my academic profile is creative practice, which means that my primary professional activity is recording and performing, releasing albums, posting videos, going on tour and things like that. As I Sandy pointed out already, calling that wild pop. It's kind of an intersection between noise, electronic music, and free improv. Newcastle, by the way, is one of the world centres for noise music, in case people weren't aware of that. I've been teaching music for 30 years, the last 15 of which at Newcastle University, where, among other things, I've taught classes in hip-hop and musics of the African diaspora, especially post-World War II jazz. My academic career is situated at a contradictory historical moment, wherein university departments have for decades been concerned primarily or exclusively with the European classical tradition, are having to open up to what they call popular music and world musics, but they do it only because they know it's necessary for business, and by they're resistant to questioning the notion that the European classical tradition is in some way an ironclad orthodoxy. So that's the site of my personal struggle. This is my first time in Jamaica, the first time I've attended a conference devoted to its music. Yet the amount of times the word sound system culture have passed my lips in class are too numerous to hazard. I've long held that the emergence of Jamaican sound system culture in the 1950s and 60s is one of the most profoundly important developments ever in global music, at least as important as the emergence of the European diatonic formalism, which accounts for everything from Bach through to 20th century high modernism, and which bebop turned so brilliantly on its head, if not more so. I'm speaking as a product of that European culture, but one who's come to understand its deviousness and mendacity through its inseparability from and advocacy of imperialism in all of its consequent atrocity. I grew up in Bridgend, South Wales, a provincial industrial context that was at the mercy of two... I should put my glasses on for that, sorry. Is it 10? All right, thanks. I'm at that crossroads of aging and my eyes are doing different things. So. Yeah, I was at the mercy of two institutions, that of schooling, state education, and the institution of mainstream media, which is a mixture of state radio and TV, the BBC, and corporate-funded so-called independent television. The key thing to point out in terms of popular music, i.e. anything that isn't classical, is that the state radio, which is to say predominantly BBC Radio 1, was always, as it is now, corporate playlisted. The BBC are paid to play an incredibly narrow spectrum of music sourced overwhelmingly from Anglo-American entertainment industries. The only times where there was a break from that pattern would be when some corporate interests saw that there might be even faster one-off killing to be made, almost exclusively peddled as novelty, which is actually how the BBC treated rap and hip-hop for decades, for at least a decade, I should say. And in a funny sort of way, that's kind of how they still treat it, even though African-American hip-hop, R&B, and UK grime have come to dominate corporate playlisting itself. Within that context, then, there were two key moments that came to define what I am as a musician and how I teach about music. Age 13, I accidentally stumbled on a way of making music that involved making recordings out of total improvisation, which has led now to this wild pop. And 10 years later, you're going to see Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing in the cinema when it had just come out. As an unsuspecting white kid, coming from the cultural context I've described, Rosie Perez dancing her own vernacular choreography to Public Enemy's Fight the Power was such a rude awakening where the impropriety was on the part of my nascent culture. I was so angry at the extent to which I felt I'd been deceived and lied to about music, I pursued any learning available that could redress it. It wasn't long before I arrived at Jamaican sound system culture, therefore, through its role in laying the foundations for hip-hop itself. By then, I'd already been listening to John Peel for over a decade, and it amazes me to think how little all the reggae, dub and dancehall that he would play was actually affecting me over those years. I guess I would have to put it down to that cultural condition. I just didn't hear it. So why was the emergence of sound system culture in Jamaica so incredibly important, or why am I saying it is in this context? One of the things I hope to get from coming here this week is a better knowledge and deeper understanding of sound system. I've already got that today, some of it. Until now, I've had to rely solely on books and documentaries. The first really comprehensive history I read was Lloyd Bradley's Bass Culture, in which he sets out a narrative that I've tapped into so many times since, whereby, and this is a highly reduced version, it's a bare outline, whereby certain sound system DJs, namely Coxsone Dodd, Duke Reed and Prince Buster, responded to a dwindling supply of imported rhythm and blues records that worked for their sounds by going into the studio with session musicians to cut new records. In doing so, by having full control of production, they were able to draw out and enhance specific characteristics of previously crucial sides that elaborate on them, even exaggerate them, such that the music we now recognize as a Jamaican style emerged. Those initial producers weren't musicians in the conventional technical sense. Through their involvement with sound system parties, they developed an approach to handling musical materials which had nothing to do with the formalism of instrumental composition, but everything to do with an immersive collective listening wherein the response of the people dancing defined the meaning of the music itself. It's something so sophisticated and almost too subtle to grasp or articulate, and it has nothing to do with anything as crude and simplistic as the European conventions of formal notation and technical construction, even though that tradition did produce some astonishing results. But recording Josh Acker's words at the beginning, it does have everything to do with the essence of music as a manifestation of the human spirit. And it established a platform for how most contemporary music is now made in the 21st century. The methodology established by those early sound system DJs has become the dominant approach to making music that most people listen to today, not just subcultures with their roots in sound system, like the increasingly important and influential continuum of jungle drum and bass through to grime, but just about any mainstream pop that you could care to mention, including stuff like heavy metal and country music. Nowadays, when a creative imagination opens up a digital audio workstation like Ableton or FL Studio, in terms of technique, they're doing exactly what those sound system DJs were doing. They're using deeply immersive listening as a means to direct sound materials in order to forge something that will resonate with a particular social collectivity. Through an intuitive understanding of what the spiritual needs of that collectivity are, because they, the producers, the artist, are as much a part of that spirituality as the people that they hope to connect with. The political implications of that are huge and generally not pointed out or discussed in my world anyway. I've banged on about it for over 15 years to groups of music students who tend to be 90% white European, not in order to teach them about some other culture, but to try and show how the essence of the sound system tradition is actually fundamental to an understanding of humanity as a whole. Because the same Europeanist ideological foundation that produced imperial colonialism also produced a mindset of individual separation, private ownership, close yourself off from the rest of humanity, within that system of thought, social togetherness is something that's reserved for later on, for having fun as a distinct thing from serious business of administration. It was easy then for someone with my background and education to overlook sound system as... Okay, thanks. Overlook sound system as incidental or even trivial. Certainly not something that could teach me about myself and my place in the world. In the UK, as a majority white British culture, we're still a long way from any serious erosion of that mindset. It amazes me how the voice of our state deals with racism by preaching tolerance, which is such an ugly word, is that the best that we can do, just to tolerate? How about listening, even immersive listening, which is to say allowing oneself to become a part of what one is hearing? Of course, you have to be able to hear it in the first place, so who's actually plugging our ears? In parallel to my practice-based research as a performer, I'm constantly trying to negotiate and formulate critical frameworks that deal with the same inherent contradictions and continuities, which is why I'm currently working my way through Fred Moten's astonishing trilogy of essay collections, Consent Not to Be a Single Being. It's the first volume, Black and Blur, that I'm borrowing this notion of eruptive outside. I'm adapting the term casually and probably ineptly in trying to situate myself as a politically aware artist and educator. In the following passage, which I'll close with, and it's pretty impenetrable, which is typical of Fred Moten, which is partly one of the things I love about his writing anyway, he's drawing on C.L.R. James's discourse on revolution in a way that proposes a dichotomy between lyric, on the one hand, and narrative. And that, for me, resonates with the opposition of colonizing territorialism and an intuitively creative fluidity, if that makes sense. Exposing the Europeanist idea that things, any things, can actually be acquired and secured, whether they're bought or taught, which is to say that Western system of European classical notation is a system of acquisition by way of fixing things down. So this is the quote I'll finish with. C.L.R. James reopens the Afro-diasporic tradition's long meditative and practical concern with spacing, incommensurability, and rupture. He works in relation to, at some distance from, and not in between that concern, and a Euro-philosophical theorization of aporia. James indicates that the question of comportment towards such issues, toward the form and content of the cut, is tied to another opposition, that between lyric and narrative, that in turn shapes yet another fundamental disjunction between the science and the art of history. The question whose answer inhabits the not in between that both Marx and, as James's phrasing, concerns the eruptive placement of the outside. If I had a PowerPoint, you'd be able to see that I'm spelling that with I-double-R, eruptive rather than eruptive. It concerns the way the literary achievement of exteriority embodies a theoretical achievement that is nothing less than a complex recasting of the dialectic. Thanks very much for listening.
Yes, I'm really glad I got to chair this session, and I'm really full enjoying this, because Dr. Edmonds now bring me forward to even Lloyd Coxon in England. And once you mentioned the 50s and the 60s, if you've been following UK music, we know how important Lloyd Coxon has also been too, and how vocal he has been about certain things in recent times. But to reason with him, to reason with same Jashaka too, it's really, as one way travel and experience his music, it's a privilege, you know. And when they tell you how they used to carry the box them and load them up and drive how many miles for a dance, and sometimes the dance don't work out, and then you have to stack up back that box and stack up back those records and those LPs and drive back, sweating down to their very shoes. Precisely, you know. It's really, when Chronic sing a song, do it for the love and do it for the likes, those brethren are the epitome of that saying, because they were doing it for the love. And the meeting place called the dance hall was really the spot to re-energize heart, mind, and soul, you know. So, yeah, I'm glad that we're really paying tribute to that era and that space of the music, and really showing how it has really carried on even unto today, even though it's changing shape and form, but how important it is, you know. So, Dr. Edmonds, give thanks for that. So, let me introduce now, without any further ado, Professor Larissa Mann. Larissa is known in other circles as DJ Ripley. She is an assistant professor in emergent media at Temple University's Klein College of Media and Communication in Philadelphia, USA, in the departments of Media Studies and Production and Media and Communication. Her work analyzes the relationship between law, technology, sovereignty, and creativity, with special focus on how changing media technologies affect the growth of communities. Covering the gamut from public speaking to research to conducting workshops to DJing at public events and blogging, Professor Mann comes to us with a wealth of publications and editorials also under her belt and knowledge to share. Her interests include how historically marginalized communities are able to create autonomous cultural expression and how Jamaican popular music practices challenge the colonial and white supremacist underpinnings of copyright law and of sovereignty itself. So, without further ado, please welcome to the fore Professor Mann to the podium.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Asante. I know that you are also a scholar, but if you could come and introduce me everywhere, that would be great. That's definitely more performers in academia for this alone, I think, is a good idea. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers, to Dr. Stanley Naya, also Erin McLeod, and everyone else who helped make this happen. The way I tend to do research is to, as much as possible when I can, go into a place where people are doing things that are interesting and observe as much as I can, as humbly as I can, and then put that in the context of theory. So for a lot of this talk, I am not going to refer to too many scholars. It doesn't necessarily mean that I haven't read any, so I'm going to give you a list of some of the people who have inspired and are teaching me through this talk, some of whom are in this room right now. These are not the only ones, but these are people whose work informs this project in particular that I do. But also, of course, if you know of other people I should be reading, I'm always grateful to hear recommendations on that. So there's two frames I'll start with to set up, and one is built into the slides, and the other I just want to mention because it's a bit of a shift away from some of how music is often talked about, which is to say, I think that music has the potential to be healing, liberatory, and revolutionary, but I think music can also perpetuate exploitation, suffering, and foster pleasure in exploitation. That is, it can serve power as well as not. So one of the things I'm interested in is under what conditions can it be liberatory, not taking for granted. So a lot of what I do is look for the things that I think are turning points where things can become more or less liberatory or subversive, those angles of power, with the idea that this work could be useful to people for fostering movements in a particular direction. So thinking of music, of moving in a particular direction, I also want to say that my concept of innovation here is not based in a linear vision of progress, that is in a straight line from a past to a future. I think in general, but especially in the context of colonial power, innovation is nonlinear, and especially we must move away from linear notions of time, because often some of the good things that happen for many communities are in the past, and the things that, and what became a future in modernity for many people was suffering and exploitation. So to innovate away from that means not only to look forward, but to look backward, to look around, and to look through time, which is a theme I've heard today in many places that I think is important to highlight, and I think one interesting feature of how a lot of Jamaican popular music practices function is by addressing time in that nonlinear way. And I'm going to talk about some of the ways that that works. So three main ways that I see this kind of innovation in sound system culture or in the dance, because I always want to include the dancers in the audience as part of this. And one is technological, as we've heard, repurposing technology that often was used for other things. So not necessarily, sometimes building new things, but also using old things in new ways, combining things together that were not combined, that kind of thing. Similarly, in the sort of creative content side, as people say in the digital era, the circulation and reuse and reincorporation of cultural works, that is, the concept of originality isn't tied just to moving away from what has already been done, but also involves re-engaging with what has already been done in different ways. I think that is one of the other ways that linear time gets disrupted in a potentially liberatory way. And then also innovation at the level of sort of social and material human relations. And this is to say that I think some of the ways that people relate to each other in sound system culture, and especially in the moment of the dance, innovate away from certain colonial constructions of sexuality, of gender, of respectability, of how you are supposed to interact with each other, and also with how the state defined things like property. And I'm thinking here both of intellectual property, which is where my work comes from. So not respecting the law of copyright, that is defining ownership in different ways than what the law says. And also in many cases in the dance, not respecting the laws of physical property either, that is to say occupying spaces that were not always made for dancing, occupying materials, climbing the sides of buildings or structures, all these things, repurposing space on people's own terms. And so I come from work that I did on copyright, which suggests that these are some ways to think about difference between colonial and decolonized or decolonial relationships, and I have a little star by decolonial because obviously I don't think it's finished or that the dance is any kind of utopia or that it's equally decolonized in all directions, that is to say with respect to gender, race, sexuality, age, ability, right? Not everything is always in its most decolonized form, but we move in that direction, I would say, when we think away from and move away from linear time. And I have in parentheses, in some cases, the sort of copyright-related things that fix a colonial mindset. So this fixation on a particular definition of originality leads us to think of music as something where you have an originator that is before, and then you have later. And if you reuse from before, it's somehow less than if you make a new original, right? And that, I think, that linear conception is not helpful. And is tied especially to affixing certain kinds of colonial relations. Also the maintenance of sort of gatekeepers to industry, to power, and to participation that have to do with the control of legal forms and institutions. So again, who owns the masters, who can afford a lawyer, who understands a contract enough to sign it in a knowledgeable way, let alone to write it, versus gatekeepers that are based on reputation, which is not equal, not always fair, but often tied to kinds of respect that can be won in other ways than through formal institutions. So if you have a big reputation in the road, it's often for things you've done that may not be things that involved having a degree or getting a title, but maybe you did something bad or good, but it enhanced your reputation in the community. So authority is centered in a different way. And then also, in general, being thing-oriented, which copyright law encourages us to think of music as a succession of objects that are bounded by an ownership relationship, and instead thinking about relationships and flows, which is the circulation of music, the circulation of culture, and the circulation of people. So those are some of the important differences I see that, for me, it was that looking at copyright questions helped me illuminate this. I don't know if it's helpful for everyone, but that's at least a window into how my mind works on this. And through the work I did in the past on this issue and on these questions, I came up with 3 concepts which I found to illuminate how I think this has worked in Jamaican popular music, and that I think, and I'm interested in seeing how useful they are for other people. So I put them forth to you here. And so one is the concept of exilic spaces, which for me is one of the preconditions for having a liberatory creative moment. And what that means is that if you have a location that is under the control to a great extent of the community who is making the expressive form, it is much more likely to remain under their control and to reflect their priorities and interests if it really is not subject to the whims of external, especially exploiting forces. And I'll talk more about that. But the extent to which certain kinds of creative spaces are exilic is something I think that can help me at least understand how likely it is that a particular musical form, for example, will be tied to liberatory experiences. It may not always work. I don't want to be mechanical about this, but this is one thing that worked for me. And then 2 other things that came out of my work are this concept of cultural intimacy, which has to do with decolonizing your relationship to other people, and this concept of rude citizenship, which is sort of decolonizing your relationship to the state. So just a little bit more on these. Exilic spaces comes from a theorist named, a sociologist named Obika Gray, whose work I find extremely helpful, who wrote a book called Demeaned But Empowered, The Social Power of the Urban Poor in Jamaica. And it's basically the idea that it's a location outside the domination and the vision of formal law and agents of the state. So people who don't have power in sort of the elite of society have control in the moment over what happens. And so for me, one example, and again, this is not total, but this is to say that's sort of the pole. And so for me, a street dance in Jamaica has been often one of these places because it's existing usually illegally or quasi-legally in many contexts, and yet it flourishes often for quite some time, not forever, but often for quite some time. People conduct themselves in ways that would not be smiled upon in other locations, but in this space, those things are even valorized and respected. And that can't happen if you feel the eye of the state and the eye of the elites are on you in a way that you have to account to them. So you're not accountable to the sort of more elite authorities in these spaces. And it's partly its very unstable and illegal nature that allows that authority to flourish, because elite people don't feel dominant or comfortable in those spaces necessarily. The bad reputation, the gully, the very things that, again, not to romanticize, these are not necessarily safe for the people in those spaces either, but they shift a little bit of the power towards the local community, because you have to be, it's easier if you are known and know people in that space to move through it. And so they're not utopian, I want to emphasize this, and they're not necessarily permanent. But they provide a space for different kinds of social relations. And one of the things that I think is produced often in exilic spaces is something called cultural intimacy. I'm calling it cultural intimacy. And this is something that's been talked on a lot in terms of the healing power of music, but I think it's especially important for music that's associated with communities who are otherwise looked down upon. If people look down on your culture, you need a place where you can center and express that. But there's a vulnerability in doing that, and that's where the intimacy comes from. That is, you don't have intimacy without the potential for being harmed. And so you need to be, you're celebrating something which you know in another context would put you on the spot. And I would say the ways that people are able to achieve moments of cultural intimacy with each other, this is a collective thing, you can't do it alone, in exilic spaces give us a sense of a different way to claim rights and dignity than the way the state tells you you should be claiming rights and dignity. So what it means to be respectable or a good citizen looks very different in those places, but those are more oriented towards the needs of those communities. And this is something that in some contexts people have talked about claiming the center on their own terms. I think this phrase is from Jennifer Rahim talking about calypso, actually, but I've seen it used in other places. So just very briefly, I'm going to talk about how I think this might travel. That was a lot of the work I have done in the past. One of the things I looked at in the more recent months is how sound system culture is referenced and used, especially in queer Caribbean club cultures in New York City. And so you have a series in the past 5 years or so, and I'm sure there's been more in the past, of parties called Raga NYC, Fake Accent, Poppy Juice, and Reggae, spelled G-A-Y. And these are explicitly centered on queer Caribbean and Caribbean American, mostly young people, who are evoking and claiming both their Caribbean heritage, their Jamaican heritage, but also claiming space as people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer people. And so they're celebrating this connection to the heritage that they have, but also in this new location and centering different aspects of their identity than are at least explicitly valorized within the dance. Although I have to give big shouts to Nadia Ellis and and of course several other scholars who have talked about that the visions of both heterosexuality and masculinity and femininity are in fact broken up in the center of dance hall in certain ways, just not on the same terms that might be recognized by outsiders. And I think this is true. I find this to resonate. That is, there is some decolonizing of gender performance happening in these spaces through, and you can hear this, I think, in the anxiety, right, about how dancers dress or how they behave, that there's some pushback, yes. So that's, I think this is convincing. So the question I have in the New York context is, are these spaces exilic spaces? Do they generate cultural intimacy? Is there a kind of rude citizenship happening here? And so I also understand that in this room and for this context, we may have a host of other questions about these spaces. And so I'm happy in the Q&A to also talk about that. But for me, these questions become really central. And so I just want to leave you with a few quotes from Neon Christina, who is Chris Umezue, who is the founder of Raga NYC and also a DJ and a performer, and very interesting person. We had an interview, and when I asked him about what feelings he had about the concept of a sound system, what emotions did a sound system evoke for him, and he said, "It's kind of sad. I'm going through these things. I have such a love for my mom. His mother's Jamaican, and he was born in New York. And the things I see on TV about Jamaica, but I was born here." And he says, "I can't be the only one. Let's try to find each other and tell our stories." And then he says, "There's so many queer Jamaican people who can't access that land or this space." And at that point, he was talking about the sound system culture. And then he said, "I met so many white people who knew more than I did about sound system culture." And you could hear that he was frustrated and unhappy about this because he felt he had a claim to this culture, but that he hadn't had space to do it. And so when I asked him what he did when he was creating, especially some of his earliest parties, he said in his earliest parties that were, again, explicitly for in New York now it's often QTPOC, queer and trans people of color, but very explicitly to be Jamaican and Caribbean. He said, "I made a huge point that every flag from the Caribbean is in the space. I would hand out flags to everybody when they came in. When I started doing it, there were so many people who said, 'Oh my God, you have my flag,' and it was Jamaica and Trinidad, but also, St. Lucia and like sort of the smaller islands who don't often feel they get so recognized. He was careful to have every Caribbean flag up there. And even not and beyond, the strictly Caribbean, he said, I can dance and feel safe and wave the flag of my country. And so then he said, in the US context, in the face of so much hate, I left an E out, I can wave a Mexican flag and dance on. And he's there speaking to, the current hysteria, frothing racist hysteria in the US against immigrants, but, against Mexicans as one category of supposed immigrants who are being vilified in media, right? So I think this suggests that, this space is not uniquely, in this case, for Caribbeans, but that it's showing its potential as a site for refuge and perhaps the healing of some cultural wounds. There's a suggestion to me of cultural intimacy. I can talk more about the various ways I think these events have been more or less successful, or what they struggle with, because there's many sort of infrastructural differences in New York that regulate how you can get access to spaces and how much control you have over them. But I'll just leave you with that as sort of an example of how I'm trying to take these concepts that I have found useful, and I'm trying to put them in motion in another place, and I'm also open to suggestions and commentary on that as well. So I'll wind up there. Thank you very much.
Yes, please could you put your hands together once more for our presenters. When Prof. Mann speaks about the cultural intimacy, I recognize that space, especially when I travel outside of Jamaica. I recognize that space quite a bit. And I like how you're redefining or applying copyright in another sense, I love that. Now, we actually have another presenter, Ms. Kerry Johnson, who will be looking at, I believe this is Gales and Gullysides, an exploration of the creativity behind reggae and calypso music, from theory to practice, methods and processes via Skype. If she's on now, we'll turn over to her.
Kerry, can you hear us?
I'm hearing you guys. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you, Doc.
Yes!
We can hear you. So you're up. Over to you, Kerry. Please go ahead.
Okay. I'm not seeing anybody though. Is that okay?
That's fine. We're not seeing you either. Some of us are seeing you, but we're hearing you, which is the most important thing.
Oh, well, that means you won't be able to see the presentation.
I sent you a message about that earlier. Unless you had sent it to the organizers before, we don't have it to upload now.
Okay. So let me start. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Kerry Johnson, and I am a doctoral candidate at the University of the West Indies. And my presentation this evening is entitled Gayels and Gullysides, an exploration of the creativity behind reggae and calypso music, from theory to practice, methods and processes. Now, part Positivity is a new trend in music, and the calypso and reggae genres have jumped full scale on that bandwagon, with tracks from the young new reggae sensation Coffee entitled Toast and calypso artist Voice alive and well. This positive vibes music is captivating and extremely infectious, with a burn out all negativity and bad vibes. Though it can be argued that this positivity augurs well for the present Caribbean youth climate, the origins, ascent, and international popularity and successes of both reggae and the calypso art forms seldom, and I dare say never, intimated positivity. In fact, the music boasted about war, rivalry, badness, debauchery, corruption, and anarchy, which are all negative attributes. These negative attributes emanated from the environment in which both reggae and the calypso artist lived, and thus dictated his habits and culture. Now, there exists a significant catalogue of literature, both academic and non-academic, about the history and development of both the calypso and reggae genres. The negative environment or space, however, which conceived and fertilized both genres, have not been given significant primary attention. This negative environment or space is the key ingredient behind the creativity and ingenuity of reggae and calypso, and is what will be examined in my paper. These negatives will be divided into three categories: the physical space, which is the Gael and the gully side; the emotional and mental space, which is slackness and smut; and finally, the pedestal or supremacy space, which is the sound clash culture and sans humanity. Everyone with me so far?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm on to the first negative, which is the Gael and the gully side. Now, the calendar is a musical accompaniment that has become synonymous with the practice of competitive stick fighting in Trinidad. Stick fighting is a type of martial arts that involves two men battling each other with sticks in a ring known as a Gael. In addition to being a martial arts genre, stick fighting is also a sport and dance, and the music that accompanies the dancing is known as a calendar. A singer, called a chantwell, is the person that leads the choir and music. And the music takes the form of a call and response, known as a lavwe, which is patois for la voix, which is the voice, which means the voice. The songs of the calendar works in tandem with the movements of the stick fighters. So they would lend the energy and they would dictate the tempo of the fight. The chantwell would instigate and invite the audience in the Gael to jump into the ring for battle. In fact, it is more to the credit of the chantwell and not necessarily the stick fighter that the success of a stick fight should be attributed to, as every stick fighter has had his own chantwell who would know the right tunes to aid in bringing out the warrior spirit in him. This extemporaneous speech and song style of the calendar is the genesis of the calypso genre. Now, focusing on the space where this calypso grew out, the Gael was a place of violence, bloodshed, and even death. The abolition of slavery, carnival became a boisterous affair, with gangs of stick fighters competing with each other and also with the police. In the early 1900s, Trinidad's carnival morphed into what was known as a Jamet carnival or a Jamet period. Jamet is patois for the French word jametre, which literally means diameter or line. And it was applied not only to the carnival activities of that time, but more significantly to a particular demographic who resided behind the East Dry River Bridge in Port of Spain. These people were referred to as Jamets by the colonial ruling powers because they were regarded as people below the diameter or the line of respectability and decency. The conditions that these people lived created an environment which augured well for the behavior of the Jamets. The Port of Spain residential community, of which the East Dry River fell under, consisted of barracks, which were simply long wooden structures set against dividing lots and separated into rooms of each, which might contain an entire family of about 4 or 5 living in that one room. Rows of rooms either faced each other about 10 or 15 feet apart or form angles and quadrangles. There were 2 to 4 latrines, which were outdoor toilets, and 1 shower in each barrack yard. In some barrack yards, shallow open drains called canals of 6 to 9 inches long ran alongside one room and out into the streets. The canals were meant to take the rain dropping from the galvanized, but tenants also emptied their wastewater from cooking and bathing and urinating into the canals as well. Naturally, a strong stench would emerge, and this stench the barricade was infamous for. Now, the barricade community developed a certain character due to the closeness of the housing units and the lack of privacy, that would naturally ensue. In the center of the barricade, there was a huge yard which served as a common space for all tenants, and there would be daily congregation in the yard. The yard was also the place where cooking, washing, bathing, and toilet usage was conducted. And because of the common shared space, there was always a heated argument and contest for the use of the one standpipe in the yard. Barricade living made the tenants highly susceptible also to contagious diseases such as tuberculosis. Now, to escape this antagonistic and putrid atmosphere, barricade dwellers would often engage in singing, dancing, and stick fighting. And it's within that space, that Gaia space, that the calypso was practiced and perfected. And also the unique art forms in Trinidad Carnival, such as ex-tempo singing, stick fighting, and the steel pan was birthed and developed as well. Now, going on over to Jamaica, to the gully side part. Now, between the 1940s and 1949, the Central Housing Unit of the Central Housing Authority of Jamaica executed a housing scheme within various parishes. Known as government yards, one of these housing schemes was built in an area known as Trench Pen, initially where cattle and livestock was raised, and later became known as Trenchtown. Trenchtown was made famous by the late great reggae legend Bob Marley in his classic hit, No Woman, No Cry. These houses were built on 200 acres of land and was segmented to resemble a residential community. This segmented housing scheme was known as a tenement yard and bears uncanny resemblance to the physical structure and characteristics of the Port of Spain barrackyards. Now, the houses that were built by the Central Authority were 4 types: H, S, T, and U. And these houses were designed to facilitate and promote communal living again. The U blocks were 1 or 2 room dwellings with communal, sanitary, and cooking facilities. Each room measured 10 to 10, 10 by 10 inches, and access to the houses was gained by a long veranda which ran the entire length of the building, and this was also communal. The S rooms were unique to the tenement yards, and these units were clustered in groups of 3s with a courtyard for communal and social activities. Now, just like the barrackyards in Port of Spain, these houses were built to accommodate the working class, aka the just above poor spectrum, and in the community, it was riddled with poverty, a lack of hygiene, privacy, crime, and deplorable living conditions. Birthed out of this impoverished space, however, was the legendary reggae group Bob Marley and the Wailers. Marley lived in one of these U-blocks when his mother moved her family there from St. Anne after she married one Toddy Livingston, who was Bunny Wailer's father. Bob then moved to another tenement yard when he got older, and it was here that he met another tenant named Vincent Tatterford, who wrote and composed No Woman, No Cry. This tenement yard is now known as Culture Yard and is now recognized as a heritage site by the Jamaica National Heritage Trust and is now known as the Trenchtown Culture Yard and Museum. So, like phoenixes rising above the ashes of marginalization, poverty, deplorable living conditions, and societal ills, calypso and reggae music were formed in the wombs of the Caribbean. These wombs I like to refer to as the Gael and the Gully style. Now, the second
5 minutes left.
Negativity that I'm going to discuss is slackness and smut. Now, having a clear mental physical space that reggae and calypso music built is an important prelude to this chapter on slackness, which can take on the hygienic, sexual, spiritual, and cerebral connotations. Here, we'll focus on the sexual. Now, the barrack and tenement yards culture shaped the mindset of the people living there, and naturally, one would deduce that the music emanating out of those rooms would be slack in nature. This was not at all so, and as a matter of fact, the music was compelling, necessary, and honest, and the indirect byproducts of living in a negative environment. Some of these compelling, necessary, and honest songs were downright smutty, but it was so craftily worded and composed that, to the ignorant ear, it would appear to be a simple song. However, these craftily worded songs would be laced with sexual overtures and innuendos, hidden in a series of puns, metaphors, and onomatopoeias. This ingenuity is what is known as double entendre and was especially prevalent in the calypso music of the 1950s and 60s and was also found in reggae music as well. Right? Now, because I'm short on time, I'll just go into the third negativity, which is sound clash and sans humanité. Now, one of the traditional indigenous elements in calypso music is an art form called extempo, where calypsonians do lyrical battle to attain the title of extempo champion. This extempo art form is one that consists of a calypsonian singing a calypso on the spot. The calypsonian is made to randomly pick a topic for his calypso from a topic pool. Immediately after choosing his topic, he then now has to sing a calypso straight from his head without any prior help, prompting, or assistance directly related to the topic, all in front of an audience eagerly awaiting to hear how well one can compose and sing impromptu. The competition begins with any number of singers, and then it boils down to the last remaining two who compete against each other in a witty, exciting impromptu showdown. It is highly competitive, and the success is judged more by the audience than the actual judges that are in the competition. There are many different melodies that the calypsonian can sing in the extempo art form, but one of the most used and popular is the sans humanité, or santimanité as we say it in Trinidad, melody. Sans humanité is a French word that literally means without mercy, and this is the persona that the calypsonian engaging in the art form of extempo would adopt to outdo and beat his competitor, as the jokes was so lyrically insulting and brutal that it shamed and forced the competitor to not to be able to respond in a similar hostile manner. Nowadays, the lyrics are more funny and witty than brutal and insulting, but the sans humanité melody is still used in the extempo art form. Now, the sound clash culture originated in Kingston, Jamaica in the 1950s as a means of entertainment and friendly musical rivalry to compete with neighboring sound systems. A sound system was simply a group of persons, usually from the same town or village, who all played music together, and these groups would meet up with other sound systems in a bid to outdo each other to attain musical acclaim. Each sound system had a selector or head DJ who would be responsible for picking the appropriate songs to clash or outdo the other system. Selectors became the stars of the group, and the reggae artists would mention them by name in addition to the name of the sound system in their songs to show affiliation to the system. This process was referred to as cutting a dub plate, and some sound systems paid handsomely to secure exclusive rights to a particular artist so that he can cut dub plates for them. This was huge bargain rights for a sound system, especially if it is a popular artist who had a big hit at the time. The audience, just as in the sans humanité and in extempo, played an integral role in the sound clashes, as it was their response that would have judged the winner and loser. Right? So in conclusion, from the three above spaces of negativity that I just dealt with, the physical space, the guile and the gully side, the mental space, which is the slackness in reggae and smut in calypso, and the pedestal or supremacy space, sound clash and sans humanité. The genres of calypso and reggae music was planted, fertilized, birthed, and developed. Negativity is not an attribute to be simply done away with, and must be conquered and not covered. When faced head-on and conquered, it can produce the most beautiful and positive things ever. After all, scientists teach us that two negatives make a positive, and I, as a culturalist, would add that negativity is mandatory for positivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry.
Thank you so much.
And let me apologize because this is me who I don't drink coffee. I don't have any stimulants working with, and so I got a little tired and didn't realize that Kerry is actually on the panel afterwards.
That's okay.
So my apologies. It means that you wouldn't have had to wait because we were running late and later, and so anyway, it's fine that you've gone ahead and presented. And so we'll take questions for all the presenters.
Yes, that's okay. That's okay.
Yes,
we're actually an hour ahead in Trinidad, so I'm on time anyway.
Okay. So over to you, Chair.
Great. So once again, could we put our hands together for Kerry Johnson's presentation, please?
Thank you.
Yeah, that stick fighting and the development of calypso was a very interesting point. The mention of trench pen, and when she mentioned trench pen and the situational factors, it reminded me of when Bob Marley sang about Trench Town Rock, rising above that situation. That song kind of tie in with that for me. And then she closed off interestingly, twinning it right back with the song, clash culture and dub plays and what it means. So, yeah. Oh, so I hope she's hearing me. Yeah. So, yeah, I really do appreciate those points, Kerry Johnson. So now the floor is open. Are there any questions for any of our presenters? We have a few minutes that we can share. Give thanks, my brother.
Hi, this question is for Larissa. Thanks for your presentation. I think that one caught me completely off guard. I really wasn't seeing the connection between copyright and anything he spoke after, because being a copyright scholar, it's just copyright, copyright, copyright. So to take it out of that context into something else is really mind-opening. So my question to you is, you talked about originality at the beginning. If you had to redefine originality, how would you redefine it to take your nuanced encounter with copyright going forward? How would you redefine originality?
That's a fantastic question. I mean, why I started partly from the idea of how I do this is I go into a place is it would matter, to me, originality is going to depend on the community, right? Originality means a good thing, but that word, even this, people use the same word to mean different things. So, for example, when I came to Jamaica to do my fieldwork, I lived here for 11 months, and I remember there was a Kings and Queens of Dancehall competition, and Skata was one of the judges, I think that was his name, producer, yeah. And this, I forget who it was who came up and he performed, singer or MC performed, and Skata said, you know, I really liked your song, I think it was really good, you're a good performer, but the music you played, did you write that yourself? And he was like, yeah. And he's like, well, I could tell you made it yourself, and I really wish that you'd picked something that was more original, that had been played out in the public before and had been tested in the audience. And I grabbed my pen so fast because, right, what he meant by original was not that he wrote it himself, right? That's what a copyright law presumption is. It's original, means I wrote it. It's original to me. But clearly what he meant by original was something that had been validated in a certain, that originality was something that is recognized by a community, which is interesting to me. It doesn't mean that he doesn't in other concepts claim ownership of copyright. I'm not saying the whole thing is exploded forever, right? But that there is a way in which he's using the word originality which suggested something else about where the value comes in that doesn't have to do with being different, right? He didn't say the song isn't, what you did isn't new and different. He said it didn't, you know, basically it clearly didn't impress him very much. And what an original thing is something that connects to something in a community. And then in another context, several times I was in studios in which there were more, it was more roots reggae and there were Rastas, some of whom were musicians and some of whom were not. And sometimes someone would play something and somebody would say, original, as a sort of praise or compliment. And it was not clear to me from the context that they meant, you wrote that yourself. You know what I mean? It seemed to have to do with origins in a roots way, in a history way, to an origin, but perhaps a collective, at least collective origin for their narrative of who the community is that is collective, right? So I'm rooting all of this in my observations because I'm more of an ethnographer, right? So I'm saying these are the way I am encountering terms that other people are using, and so I am also open to being corrected. But from my sense was, certainly the way people make music, they don't act as if they think originality in the way copyright law defines it is as a priority, because people don't say, oh, I would never jump on that rhythm, I'm gonna write my own rhythm. Right? People don't behave that way. So, and I think that's fine. I'm a huge fan of rhythm culture, right? So for me, that might be different. You know, it's not for me. It's sort of for different communities, right? And so copyright law is a particular set of definitions for the appropriate way to handle recordings. But in Jamaica, copyright law didn't change after independence. So from my perspective, why would anyone assume that it was written to benefit the black majority, especially in Jamaica? Because the law stayed the same from when every law was existing only to benefit England, right? Like, why would we assume copyright law is universal? The people who made it universal were the people who tried to make a lot of things universal, but freedom wasn't one of them, right? So how to unpack that, I don't know any other way than to go to the communities and see how people are, I think, moving in other directions, and it doesn't mean they don't use the same words sometimes. And I don't want to say that ownership is not important, but in practice, people define ownership differently. And also for me, some of the questions about copyright have to do with people getting paid. But there's always been multiple ways people got paid from music. And for me, the systematic problem with getting paid has to do with reparations. Like, it's not only about musicians. So, and that's true in the US too. Like, people say, oh, musicians want to get paid. And I'm like, well, yeah, but I mean, so do nurses and doctors, like nurses and school teachers. Like, the problem of how people get paid is a problem for society as a whole. Credit, originality, these are all tied to cultural practices. I'll shut up now. I have a book on this, so that's why I'm going so long. Sorry.
Are there any other questions? I guess the noes have it. Excellent.
Okay, I just want to say a quick word about the exchange that has just gone on. I think many things that I've read also mention the concept of exclusivity for the sound system rather than originality, as what matters is not so much that the thing is new or different, but that it's an exclusive configuration in a given time and space. So for your question, that might be also something to... I think Lloyd Bradley mentions it in bass culture, but several other people do it as well. I've got a question for Stephanie, which is just a factual question, actually.
What?
A factual question about the links between Kuduro and dancehall. Are these explicit links? I mean, did you find in your fieldwork any sort of references to dancehall in Kuduro, maybe?
That's what I was saying. Apart from people referring to reels, I like to Move It, which is a poppy crossover dancehall-y international hit. And keep a lot of people were saying, oh, Reel to Reels, I like to Move It was one of the original Kuduro. Original Kuduro instrumentals, and they would dance over that or MC over that. No, that's what I was saying was my predicament. I would see all these similarities, and on top of that, there are actually people in Angola who say that they are do dancehall, that regard themselves as dancehall singers or raga muffin singers, what more the term they would use. So that's why I came up with this whole idea of sound system cultures of the Black Atlantic, to actually see these things together and then look at the different ways of producing knowledge and actually honoring that configuration as something that motivates certain modes of performance. I'm sure that, I mean, I haven't heard anyone saying I was listening to dancehall, and even, I mean, the ways what in media parlance is called camera grilling, the way people orientate their performance towards the camera, dancers do and singers do, is something that we see in Kuduro and we see in dancehall, we see it elsewhere too, but it's very specific in that kind of colorful, flamboyant styling and the way that a song and a dance move go hand in hand. And so, long-winded answer, no.
Can I jump in on that for a second? I think one thing that helped me think about a connection too, although I think this theoretical one helps me, is much more articulate. But part of it is if we look at these practices as responses to a particular historical situation, where it is, then you can say there may be connections because people are experiencing similar pressures, they have access to similar technologies, right? It's like a parallel evolution sort of thing, although I avoid natural metaphors usually. But at the very least, I think there are, that's what the Black Atlantic is, in a way, is a similar orientation and pressure across the Atlantic, right? So we might expect it to produce some similar responses in some ways. I don't know if that's part of it. I don't know if that helps.
Well, at this juncture, I'd have to say thank you for the questions. Thank you again to the panelists. And thank you for your time and patience. We're going to make a quick transition from this panel to the final panel. So please, stretch your legs for like 5 minutes and let's resume. Thank you.